You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. Once again, we're going to take a very quick half hour and continue slowly, even the half hour is quick, to go through the Gospels. We've been at this for a few years now, and we are in the Gospel of John. And we're in what's called the Passion narrative. Last time, Peter has just denied Christ, and he's on his way to Pilate. It's a fascinating story that culminates, of course, in crucifixion and resurrection. We'll get there right after this.
WOW! Working for Orphans and Widows has been caring for orphans and widows in Africa and India for over 20 years. Key to its vision is partnership with local champions who engage hundreds of church-based volunteers in home-based care for the sick and the dying in their own humble homes. They are defenseless and afflicted. They are the least of these that Jesus would have us love and care for. Our partnered champions are based in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and India. They provide faithful, accountable, and godly care for thousands. Together with WOW, they truly are the hands and feet of Jesus to the sick and the dying. Founder and President Jim Cantelon has been committed to both teaching the gospel via Jim Cantelon Today TV and practicing the gospel through WOW. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So, friends, as I said a moment ago, we're just sort of at the beginning of what's called the Passion narrative, the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, which then led to the resurrection and the profound impact it had on the Christian church. But last time, Jesus had been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed by Judas, of course, and then deserted by the other disciples, although two of them thought better of it and followed at a distance, one being Peter, and the other, we think, being John, the author of the book of John that we're studying now. A very tense time, to say the least. This had happened throughout the course of the night, and now it was early morning, and Jesus was being brought before Pilate, who was the Roman procurator. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind here, you know, when we read the story of Jesus, and we, you know, those of us who are believers, we focus, you know, our faith on what the Bible teaches about Christ. Israel, as we call it, or Palestine as it was known then, was just a sandbox. It was a rump province, if you will, or territory of the Roman Empire. It was not a prestigious place to be assigned as procurator, as governor, but that's what had happened to Pilate. And probably when he got the news, at whatever time it was, you know, from the Roman hierarchy, that he should, you know, pack his stuff and get over to Caesarea, which was the home base of the Roman procurator in Palestine, he probably saw it as a demotion. It was not honorific at all. And so he probably was a disgruntled, maybe underachieving, maybe even failure of a bureaucrat, and yet face-saving, or maybe political connections, family connections, whatever, the Roman authorities have said, well, let's just send him over there, you know, that little strip of land that's all sand and desert and, you know, inconsequential. So you might assume that Pilate had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, if not a bit of an inferiority complex, but he was enjoying, if you will, lording it over his Jewish, especially his religious Jewish subjects, because it didn't take much to rile them up, and I think he got some kind of pleasure out of them being riled up. It certainly seems to be the case in the narrative we're about to read. Having said that, let's pick it up in verse 28 of John 18 and read a few verses before we say anything else. So, verse 28, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor, that being Pilate. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." So already you got a bit of a conflict there. They didn't like each other. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Then Pilate went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. In other words, what are you talking about? "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again, and maybe you could read stormed out again, to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it's your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Okay, let's continue a bit. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him up to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Okay, we'll carry on, but let's just take it that far for the moment. Now, I've mentioned before on JCT many times, and also in my book, Cantelon's Casual Commentary, which is available on the internet. Just type in Cantelon's Casual Commentary, and it'll come up on several internet book retailers. Nevertheless, I've said many times that it's not my concern to attempt to harmonize the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and with John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they kind of have a similar construction, similar time frame, and similar emphases, although Luke is dissimilar in the sense that he was not an eyewitness of Jesus' life and ministry as Matthew and Mark had been. Nevertheless, the Gospel of John is a kind of a standalone in terms of its emphasis, its style, and there are definite disparities from time to time in terms of timeline, some detail, and many times over the years there have been whole scholarly efforts as well as maybe less than scholarly efforts to try to make Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all basically say the same thing the same way. What's clear, however, from history, friends, is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not have an editorial committee. They did not sit down and say, "Now let's make sure we're all talking the same way and singing off the same song sheet here." They didn't do that. So what I do when I'm writing about this, when I'm talking to you about it as I am now, I take each book as it's written with full regard for the unique perspective each author brings to the history of Jesus' life and ministry. They're observers, all right? And they're not giving you detail, chronological even, They're writing on the basis of memory, and there are gaps. And even in terms of Jesus' overall ministry, they all admit, but John is very specific about it. Hey, we're only giving you part of the story. It's, there's so much more that Jesus did and said, but we haven't told you. And John will say later in the gospel here, at the end of the book, if everything Jesus said and did was written down, the world could not contain the books. Now that's an exaggeration, but he's making a point. It would be huge. So we have a summary. We have memory involved here. We have perspective involved here. And so don't expect Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to all say the same thing the same way with the same timeline. So I make no comment on the date or the nature of the Last Supper, as John remembers and records it. We just looked at that last program. Nor will I comment on the divergence of detail with regard to the Passion that subsists in the four accounts. It's John's history before us here, not Matthew's, not Mark's, not Luke's. So I say, let's just carry on. So having said that, John chose not, as I mentioned, to record any detail a lot of detail, let's put it that way, that would certainly fascinate us. But in terms of his appearance before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, he doesn't say much about that. But he did provide a unique description of Jesus and Pilate in conversation, which is absolutely fascinating. And he gives kind of the intermittent interreaction, if you will, between Pilate and Jesus' accusers, between Pilate and the ones he loved upsetting, even as they loved upsetting him. So, if this were a Shakespearean play, it might have been presented as an interplay between the principal actors and a chorus, perhaps. And I'm going to suggest 6 scenes, okay? Just bear with me here. First scene, Pilate, annoyed, big time. He's really ticked. He's annoyed. For one thing, it was early morning. He may not have had his coffee. And for another, this raucous crowd of accusers was flaunting their moral/religious superiority by even refusing to enter Pilate's hall of judgment, because in doing so, they would be associating too closely with the Gentiles and would be made impure. And Passover was just now beginning, and they wanted to, be pure for Passover. In fact, we're almost at the end of this segment. When I lived in Jerusalem, when I was pastoring there, before Passover, there was a whole week where the ultra-religious Jews would cleanse everything in their houses and get rid of all leaven. And believe me, it was a major task. They would even clean their utensils, clean their dishes. The grocery stores they'd remove anything leavened. If they couldn't remove it, they had curtains over the shelves that had leavened products. It was all a part of being pure, if you will, pure of leaven, pure of imperfection for Passover. And that's what's going on here. We'll pick it up right after this break.
For over 20 years, WOW, working for orphans and widows, has been caring for vulnerable and at-risk women and children hard hit by the HIV and AIDS pandemic in Africa and India. WOW engages with local partner champions and church-based volunteers in the care of the desperately needy. Now, in recent months, we have expanded our reach to Ukraine. Over 8 million refugees have fled the ravages of that war-torn country, mostly women and children, including many orphans. Our partner in East Europe tells us of the busing of Ukrainian orphans through the night to safety. Churches have become refugee centers, opening their buildings to become safe havens in the rescue. And WOW has come alongside. We have begun supporting this rescue work, but there is so much more that we must provide to these heroic churches. They need funding to continue for hundreds of orphans yet to come. We may be only small players, but you can partner with us in the rescue of Ukrainian orphans. WOW is a proven ministry. We are grateful for your support. Call, write, or log on to wowmission.com and be inspired.
So as I was saying before the break, these accusers of Jesus, they manhandle Jesus from Caiaphas' house, bring him across the old city to the Antonia fortress, which is also called a palace. And believe me, it's not really a palace. I've been there many times. I mean, it's impressive, but it's not palace-like by any stretch. Nevertheless, they refused to go into the hall of judgment because it's the place where Gentiles give judgment, and they were Orthodox Jews, and they did not want to be in the toxic atmosphere of Gentiles because it would render them impure for Passover. And so I was telling you a little bit about how they purify things in Jerusalem, as I saw it time and time again when I was pastoring in Jerusalem for 7 years. They don't want to be unclean. So they stay out in the courtyard and they shout and they yell from there, okay? Because Pilate is a distance away. This would have been more than off-putting for Pilate. Further, it seemed that from his perspective, the ruckus was much ado about nothing. A mere, and he did mean mere, a mere religious dispute. Nothing to do with him as the Roman proconsul. Deal with him yourselves, he shouts. We can't, they respond, because we want him executed, and only you have the power to do that, Pilate. If they'd had the power to kill Jesus, they would have stoned him for blasphemy, because that's what they accused him of when he was in front of Caiaphas. But they could or they would not pick up a stone on a Sabbath, and Passover involved major Sabbath implications. They wanted Jesus dead now, okay? We finally got the guy. We want him out of our lives, out of our hair, out of our space now. So crucifixion was the Roman punishment for sedition, for high treason, or some kind of a threat to the emperor, the Roman emperor. So their plan was to convince Pilate to execute Jesus as an insurrectionist. And John observes that Jesus had already predicted the cross. So, from Jesus' perspective, this was no surprise. Okay, scene number 2, you got the interrogation. Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, by the way, were the ruling council of 70 or 71, depending on who you're reading, highly placed elders who oversaw civil law in Jerusalem and also had a lot to do with political law because there was no such thing really as separation of church and state at that time. They had condemned Jesus already just a few hours ago as a blasphemer. But before Pilate, they accuse him as a messianic wannabe. They don't bring him on the basis of blasphemy. They bring him on the basis of his presenting a threat to Rome because the Messiah would be king of the Jews. I mean, they were using their heads here. They knew that Pilate would not have any motivation to crucify Jesus for being a blasphemer because what did he care? He was a Roman. He wasn't a Jew. But if they could somehow convince him that Jesus was a threat to the emperor, a threat to the empire, and as a threat to the empire and the emperor, it would be a threat to Pilate. That's another thing. Okay, that would get Pilate's attention. So, they throw this at Pilate, and he's flummoxed. He hadn't heard the term before, King of the Jews, and he turns to Jesus. What? Are you King of the Jews? He's very quizzical. I'm not Jewish. I don't know what these guys are talking about. These are your people. What's up with your chief priests and this spurious charge? Jesus acknowledged that he was a king, but his kingdom was not political. His kingdom was no threat, to the earthly kingdom of Rome. His was a kingdom built on the truth. He hadn't come to be king. He had come to be the personification of truth, which is a totally different matter. Really, Pilate says? So what is truth? People have been asking that question ever since. You have neighbors who ask you that question, directly or indirectly. What is truth? Everyone to himself. Your truth is not my truth is not their truth. We all have our own truth. There's no such thing as objective truth, and that's one of the toxic elements of our secular culture, that truth is a relative term. Third scene, Pilate tries to dodge. He tried a maneuver by reminding the angry crowd, which was growing by the minute, that the Romans honored the tradition of releasing a prisoner at Passover. And then, perhaps lacking a bit of impulse control, he suggested that he release the king of the Jews. Let him go, knowing no doubt that this would infuriate the people. And remember, Pilate got great delight out of infuriating the people. He didn't want to have, full-scale rebellion, but it pleased his inferiority complex and his small-mindedness and his failing status as a Roman official to have this kind of power over the people. Give us Barabbas, they roared. Barabbas? Scene 4, another maneuver. Pilate's really annoyed by now. This early morning intrusion by people with whom he had had previous run-ins was too presumptuous and obnoxious by half. Maybe if I flog this strange man and humiliate him before the people, they'll back off and go home. So after scourging Jesus and wrapping a purple robe, mocking his royalty, around his bloody back and shoulders, he presented him crowned with thorns and a derisive, "Here's your king." The people raged, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate shouted, "Do it yourselves! It's my judgment he's innocent." But then the people said something that struck a chord of fear in Pilate's superstitious soul. "He has made himself the Son of God." What? Fifth scene, Pilate's afraid. Like all the Romans, Pilate would have believed in gods and demigods whose offspring possessed supernatural powers. He also believed these gods sometimes took on human form and patrolled the earth. And some of what he had heard about Jesus' supernatural powers now came to the fore. Son of God? What if he is? Let's pick it up in the scripture. Verse 9b, "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate heard this, and believe me, this scared him, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of the preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate said. "We have no king but Caesar." Can you believe this? "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Now, Pilate's operating here with a nod of fear in his chest. When he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" he asked that with fear. Where are you from? Because the people just said he's a son of God. Or he says he's a son of God. What if he is? "Don't you know I have power of life and death over you, Jesus?" Jesus says, "What? Your power is delegated." Jesus could have said a lot more at that point, but he didn't. And Pilate, conflicted, goes out to the crowd again and declares his intent to release Jesus, and the crowd retorts, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." That was the crunch point for Pilate. The last thing he wanted was a report to get back to Rome, to Caesar, the emperor, that he was disloyal, or that he had let a man go free who was claiming to be king. I mean, this was a huge threat to the empire, even though it was just one guy. And this would have really struck fear to Pilate. So he caves, probably close to emotional exhaustion. He brings Jesus back out to the mob, sits in the judgment seat. Here is your king, crucify, crucify. He says, okay, take him away and crucify him. So Pilate caved. The people caved by saying, we have no king but Caesar. Can you believe? The words must have stuck in their throats. Their king was Messiah, not Caesar. But they were so keen to see Jesus crucified, they were prepared to say that. So everybody caves and Calvary awaits.
Wow! Working for Orphans and Widows is a trusted Christian charity reaching out to the sick and the dying, the least of these in pandemic-stricken Africa and India. For over 22 years, Jim and Kathy Cantelon have engaged with community-based champions and church volunteers in the care for those whom Jim calls society's weakest link. Everything from home-based palliative care to the rescue and protection of young women and girls who are victims of abuse is done in the name of Jesus and is overseen by local partner champions and an army of church-based volunteers. WOW has a proven track record. Check it out on wowmission.com, or if you wish, you can call or write to us. Its sustainability is dependent on the support of faithful friends like you.
So friends, this is a pretty dramatic story we're reading here, and most of you are familiar with it, no doubt. I don't know how many times I've read the passages about Jesus' arrest and his crucifixion and all that surrounded this horrible moment. But every time I read it, I'm moved and deeply moved, because what you have here is God in the flesh, God incarnate, God who came to Bethlehem, a baby born in a stable, who was raised, as a religious Jew in Nazareth, who didn't begin his ministry till he was 30 years old, but whose 3 years of ministry literally changed the world then and now. There is no one who has impacted the world like Jesus of Nazareth. And so I take this really seriously, and that's why I take all of this time, because I believe that the testimony of Jesus, as the book of Revelation says, is the spirit of prophecy. Thanks for watching. See you again next time.